Hi there everyone in the Geekonomics community. Welcome to another weekly edition, a weekly revision session for GCSE and A-level economics. Today I'm going to focus on the stimulus material for those of you who are studying GCSE economics with the OCR exam board. So I have in front of me the A593 stimulus material for the UK economy and globalization. And today I'm going to talk through this, try to explain some of the data for you, and then to consider some of the questions which you might be asked in the exam. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. Page 3. We are presented with a table which shows the value of exports and imports of a country.
Would Mr. Grant and Dr. Howe please contact reception?
Now we may get these little interjections from time to time, I do apologise. So we're presented with this data, and let's now have a look at the two paragraphs which introduce the table. So it says trade in services forms just one part of the current account of the balance of payments. You will be expected to know that there are four components to the current account. They are trade in goods, trade in services, net property income from abroad, and current transfers. What you are shown is just one little snapshot from that, which is the trade in services. So the paragraph goes on and it says, this is one aspect of trade where the UK performs strongly, and it continues to run a trade surplus. Now a trade surplus, ladies and gentlemen, that is when the value of the exports is greater than the value of the imports. Note that the table says value of exports and value of imports. It is not quantity of exports or quantity of imports. Very important that you refer to values, not quantities. Reading on in paragraph 1. In part, this is a result of specialisation within the UK. You'll need to know what we mean by the term specialisation. And for those of you who are not aware, it's to do with international trade, whereby we specialise in the production of one good or service. Primarily, if you think of London, the financial sector, where we're fantabulous at insurance, finance, etc. But of course, we're not excellent at producing, for example, bananas. Therefore, we have to import bananas. So we therefore find that it's better to specialise in finance and export that, and then trade with other countries who are good at producing bananas. Paragraph 2. The data below shows the 5 most important export markets for UK services and the 5 countries from which the UK imported the most in 2011. And again, remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is just for services. Nota bene, NB, this is just services. Now, I think potentially you could be asked some very straightforward questions about this. The exam paper is always very straightforward in the initial circumstances. So you may get questions like, identify the country to whom the UK exports the greatest value. Something very straightforward like that. But you may also be asked to maybe calculate the UK's trade balance. That would be the services trade balance with the countries listed. So that's a potential one. You may also be asked something maybe slightly more difficult, which might be to perhaps come up with reasons why the UK might run a trade deficit with a country, or reasons why we might have a trade surplus with a particular country. Trade deficit means that the value of imports is greater than the value of exports, and vice versa for a trade surplus. So why might we have a trade surplus with our country? Why might we find that we can export a lot to them, certainly to a greater extent than imports? Well, other countries might find our goods and services of a great quality, much higher quality, so they decide to buy them from us rather than from elsewhere. We might have lower rates of inflation relative to other countries, and so our goods are rising in price more slowly than elsewhere, and so people buy UK goods and services instead. It might be the case that the exchange rate works in our favour, and so the exchange rate might be depreciating, and if that was the case, our export prices would be falling, and so they'd be more competitive. Let's consider the trade deficit. In the instance of a trade deficit, it might be the case so we're trying to answer the question, why would the value of imports be greater than the value of exports? So why might that actually be the case? Well, you could argue, for instance, that the exchange rate is working in favour of imports, so that would have to be an appreciation of the currency, which would make imports cheaper, and so we might import a lot more goods as a consequence. It might be that other countries deem our goods and services actually not to be of very high quality, and so they don't want them at all, and so the value of our exports is very minimal, hence the value of imports is greater than the value of exports. It might be that other countries say, hey UK, stop swamping our markets with your goods and services, we're going to ban them, we're going to put protectionist measures in place, and so they erect tariffs, quotas on our exports, so we can't sell them into foreign markets, and so again the value of our imports would be greater than our exports. And again, I think on this particular extract you might be asked to identify potential remedies. Now, remedies, generally speaking, would probably only apply to a trade deficit position, so ways in which you might cure a trade deficit. And you might want to think of things such as there you'd like to maybe engineer a depreciation of the currency, make your exports more competitive. Or you might want to maybe put the brakes on your economy a little bit, and that would mean that you suck in less imports. Or you might want to be more direct than that, and you might want to say, well, we're going to ban your goods and services, or not ban them's the wrong word really, it'd be restrict them by way of tariff or quota. So do be prepared for the very easy questions, but also the more difficult questions, asking you to identify reasons why trade deficits and surpluses might arise, but then also policies that could be introduced in order to correct those problems. Okay, so let's move on now, ladies and gentlemen. Let's consider pages 4 and 5. So that's referring to this data, figures 2 and 3. And again, I would draw your attention to the fact that this is summarizing the trading position, as it says at the top, trading position for services. Note that it says that overall current account balance continued to show a deficit. Now, you've got the export values here, 97,311 million, and you've got the value for imports as well. Clearly the value of imports is much less, about half, than exports. So we're running a services trade surplus. Now, given that it says in the first paragraph the overall current account balance showed a deficit, I think it would be sensible on your part to consider a few things. Number one, be able to calculate the trade surplus, which is shown here. That would be the services trade surplus. But also be able to give an explanation as to why the overall current account balance continues to show a deficit. Now, if you think about that, you'll know that services is just one of the 4 components of the current account. And so even though the services balance is well into surplus, in our case in the UK, it is our goods balance which is very significantly in deficit, and as a consequence of that, it drags the whole current account balance into deficit. So do be able to explain that in your answer. And I don't really think that there's much else you potentially be asked on this. Maybe some very sort of straightforward elementary questions to just pull out figures and so on. But the key thing here, I'm sure, is note that it's services all the time, and note that the overall current account is more than just services. Let's move on. Page 6. So we've looked at 3 pages there, and the first 3 pages are all to do with the UK's trade position. And now we're moving into page 6, which is focusing on the process of globalization as described here. So let's just read through the little intro here that we're given in the first paragraph. Some economists highlight the possible gains to the UK and other economies of following free trade. Free trade, ladies and gentlemen, the absence of barriers to trade, your protectionist policies. Clear them away. Clear away the tariffs, clear away the quotas, clear away the excessive red tape, clear away the voluntary export constraints, clear all these things away. Clear them away. In contrast, other economists recognise that there might be problems from globalisation. So we've got a sort of advantages, disadvantages argument going on here. Critics claim the overall impact of globalisation on the UK economy has been negative. Some of the critics have called for the use of protectionist policies to limit these problems. And then you're presented with this little tripod, and let me, pardon the pun, just adjust my tripod here, ladies and gentlemen, just to get this in shot. So we've got this little tripod here, and we've got increased negative externalities, global interdependence, and possible increased income inequality. And the author is saying that these are some of the disadvantages of globalization and free trade. So let's take each of these in turn. What's a negative externality? Well, negative externalities are associated with excessive production in many places. So if you think of China, the terrible smog that appears in China from pollution, smog is a negative externality. A negative externality, ladies and gentlemen, the definition is that it's a production or consumption decision which negatively impacts a third party who's an innocent bystander. They had no real, well, they didn't have any impact or influence on the decision-making process. So if I was to light up a cigarette in class, which I wouldn't do, of course, because I'm a triathlete, but if I was to light up a cigarette, then the students in the class would inhale the cigarette smoke. And although I decided to do the smoking, they would be adversely and negatively impacted. So when countries globalize and manufacturing plants move to these very low-cost labour areas where there are very little restrictions on health and safety and pollution and so on, you generally tend to get a build-up of these negative externalities. Global interdependence. Globalization is not indefinitely going to continue perhaps, but as the world continues to globalize and the links between countries get significantly greater and greater, then that brings with it not only problems but benefits, because They're called systemic effects. So when you get problems in one area of the globe, because the whole world is now so interrelated, that has a knock-on effect on the rest of the world. So if we think of Japan, a couple of years ago, earthquake, tsunami, well, the Nissan factory in Sunderland, northeast of England, that was adversely affected because they were unable to get supplies from Japan, where the parent company is based. So this whole idea of global interdependence, producing where the labour is the lowest cost, yeah, great, but brings problems too. And then finally, on the right hand side, increased income inequality. Increased income inequality. Now, of course, globalization, many would argue that that actually raises standards of living across the globe, and the differentials in incomes between nations are actually getting smaller, and that is true. But in some nations, if you think of the likes of Nigeria, for instance, which I believe is mentioned in this case study later, very rich in oil, and the economy is actually growing, as it mentions in the pre-release, but actually, because that wealth is held probably by the corrupt few in the country, they are creaming off all the wealth, and everyone else is getting poorer and poorer and poorer. So that is also claimed to be a disadvantage, obviously, of globalization. So I think this extract is really teeing you up for an explanation of these points, and also perhaps a discussion of what are the pros and the cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of globalization. I could see a question, for example, 12 marks, potentially discuss the advantages and disadvantages that arise from free trade. Discuss whether it would be appropriate to introduce protectionist policies, and you need to know the diagrams that go alongside tariffs and quotas, and be able to discuss the pros and cons, that type of thing. So let's move on, ladies and gentlemen, page 7. Let me just adjust the tripod once again, ladies and gentlemen. So you're presented here with two extracts, not sure where they're from, just newspapers or something, and once again these focus on globalization and trade. So there are a few things that you need to be aware of. Let's just read through it. The WTO, let's stop there. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization tries to get countries around the table, all the countries of the globe, representatives from every country, and get them to reduce protectionist policies, because it is the widely held view is that free trade leads to favourable rises in world trade and hence standards of living. The WTO has cut its trade forecast for growth for 2013 because of risks from the Eurozone crisis. You need to have a little bit of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, about the Eurozone crisis. So you need to know about the pigs, ladies and gentlemen. I don't mean the oink oink version. You need to know about the PIIGS, so that's Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain. Said to be the economies in Euroland which have been struggling the most. And Germany and France in particular, those two nations have been responsible for providing them with bailout after bailout after bailout. And of course, when you get a crisis in areas of the globe and people lose their jobs and incomes decrease, as a consequence of that, you get less trade, obviously. And then countries start to look within and they say to themselves, okay, we're going to try and grow our economy, and one way we're going to do that is we're going to, rather than buy from abroad, we're going to buy domestic goods instead. How are we going to stop foreign goods getting in? We're going to introduce protectionist policies such as tariffs and quotas, and hence the reason it says in the first paragraph that cuts its growth forecast because of risk from the Eurozone crisis and from greater protectionism. Countries, they sort of retreat like a tortoise retreats within its shell to protect itself. Second paragraph. Global trade had been forecast to grow by 4.5% in 2013, but it was later only expected to grow by 3.3%. WTO Director Pascal indicated that countries might turn to protectionism as other attempts to boost growth had not been as successful as he had hoped. So you might there want to consider what might the policies be that a country would use to boost economic growth. So think of things like increasing government spending, reducing rates of taxation, reducing base rates of tax. All of these types of things would be what we would call reflationary policies or expansionary policies. The WTO added that China's growth could continue to outpace other leading economies, cushioning the slowdown in the growth of world trade, but world exports will still be constrained by weak demand in Europe. China, one of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, as I'm sure you know, growing, I guess, at around about an average of 78%, 7 to 8%, not 78, per annum. And of course, when an economy like that is growing, it's sucking in huge amounts of imports, and as a consequence would help to cushion the slowdown in the growth of world trade. However, it's still not going to compensate for the very dramatic fall in domestic demand by 500 million people who make up the European Union, for example. The 28 nations of the European Union, for that matter. And then moving down, India's Commerce Minister, India, one of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, had said that the current round of trade negotiations at the WTO must continue. He told the BBC that a potential collapse of these talks could be disastrous for the world economy, adding that global trade has struggled to recover from the 2008-9 financial crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis, leading to the greatest recession in post-war history, with problems in the Eurozone and turbulence in the Middle East. So here's a few things you may wish to consider on this particular figure 5 and 6. I think you'll need to know what the Eurozone crisis is and why it would negatively impact trade. You'll need to know what protectionism is and be able to give examples of protectionist policies. I would make yourselves aware of the diagrams for that. You'd want to consider why countries would turn to protectionism, perhaps mentioning import substitution, whereby countries decide to produce goods themselves rather than importing. And a couple of questions might be, sort of exam questions might be, to what extent would continued growth in China cushion the slowdown in the growth of world trade? Or explain why a collapse in trade talks would be disastrous for the world economy. That type of thing. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take a little breather there, and I will be back with figures 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 and 13 at a later date, possibly imminently, possibly next week. Any questions? Send me your questions, or if there's anything else you'd like me to go over, again, get in touch. Thanks for watching G-Economics.